Oh, I started the first Ohio SNAP chapter. SNAP is an international organization. It was started by Barbara Blaine,
Yep.
by the way, born out of her abuse right here in the Toledo Catholic Diocese. And she went on to start what now is an international movement, long after her death.
Right.
And then I started the first Ohio chapter of SNAP, Survivors Network of Those Abused by Priests and Other Church Leaders.
What year was that?
That Barbara started
You
this?
that you started the first Ohio.
2002. So I've been doing this a long time.
Yeah. Oh yeah, of course. I mean, I've not met you previous to this, but definitely know the name. I mean, from being in town since 1998. So, yeah. So anyhow, I appreciate you sitting down because, like you said, you've done all these other interviews and documentaries, and we are trying to do something different here. So, when did you first become aware of Sister Pahl's murder?
When I was a kid in the 80s, I attended the Community of the Risen Christ Church, Catholic Church. We were the hippie church on wheels. Our altar was on wheels, 4th floor of the Catholic Club, right? And she was murdered at the Mercy Hospital right downtown, and we would drive by there on the way to church. And it was a horrible, horrible crime at that time. I mean, who murders a Catholic nun? So I remember that vividly when I was a kid.
And here's the really interesting thing to me. Talking to other people, they said back in the 1980s, Catholic priests, they were above the law. And I know you would argue they're probably still above the law in some ways. But back in 1980s, I heard a story about a child telling his mom, father so-and-so abused me, and she smacked him.
Right.
And said, don't you ever say that about father. So when you think about, they were like almost godlike, and particularly back in 1980, the way people viewed them.
Only culturally, certainly not on the books. The laws have always been very clear. Priests have never been given, on the law books, a special dispensation as it relates to molesting kids, let alone murdering people.
Yeah, but when we're thinking back to 1980, and again, the assistant police chief, prosecutor, devout Catholics, in your opinion, I'm sure that played a role in this him not being charged back in 1980.
Shamefully so. Shamefully so that Father Robinson was given a pass. I mean, Sister Margaret Ann Pahl devoted her life to Christ. That's the vows that she took. That's all she did. She gave her life to Jesus and was murdered in a very violent, graphic, horrific way on Holy Saturday. And they have the prime suspect within 3 weeks. The whole investigation, what was touted as Toledo's most notorious murder investigation, is wrapped up in 3 weeks flat. If that is how you investigate the most notorious murder, what real hope does anyone else have?
Yeah, and I lost the one thought I was going to say right there, but geez, I apologize. So anyhow, let's just jump. Well, no, that's what I was going to ask. So what do you know? And again, I know it's 1980, and you were a small kid back then. But what have you since learned about Sister Pahl as a person, who she was, her contribution to the church?
She was a Mercy nun, and I went to a Mercy high school. I went to Macaulay High School. So I always sort of felt akin to Sister Margaret Ann Pahl because she was a Mercy nun. And through Lee Pahl, I've learned that she took her vows extremely serious. She was extremely devout. She really lived her vows and embodied her vows fully.
I think Julia Bates had said that she may have even led the fundraising for the hospital garage or something like that. Do you know anything about that?
I don't. I know she recycled soap shavings to save money and You know, she was obviously in the chapel very early that morning that she was murdered, just getting it ready, you know, really early in the morning, just to have it ready and to be ready for Easter weekend, yeah, when she was murdered.
And so this case pretty much lied dormant, for lack of a better word, between, you know, 1980 and 2004. And I know you had told Melissa that it wasn't a cold case. I mean,
No.
It was right there.
It was right there. They had Father Robinson. They had the murder weapon. They had him in an interrogation room. And enter Monsignor Schmidt, Monsignor Jerome Schmidt, who back then was known as the sort of wheeler dealer within the Catholic diocese. He was the go-to person. He had carried a lot of political power, which is unfortunate the way he chose to use it. And I understand he did a lot of great things in Toledo and for people, but he failed Sister Margaret Ann Pahl, and she was no less a child of God.
Yeah, so what other, when you think back to 1980, what other issues do you have, or can you point to and say, yeah, the church made this go away?
Clergy sexual abuse cases. There was well-documented collusion between the police and Toledo Catholic Diocese for making these cases go away. Even if you look back at news coverage, Barbara Blaine often spoke publicly about how she would have to be identified as the victim, but her perpetrator was not. The priest, Father Chet Warren, a reputed child predator, well-documented child predator, was not identified publicly. She had to be identified. So there was quite a bit of victim blaming and shaming back in the 80s, for sure. Priests were quietly sent away to Servants of the Paraclete, among other places, for, quote, treatment. But these cases were not adjudicated. They were quietly, the trash was passed from unsuspecting community to unsuspecting community. You know, another case during that same time would have been Father Kokoczynski. You know, he raped two brothers in the same house. This has been well covered in the news. And neither brother knew that until years later, when finally they filed a lawsuit against the Toledo Catholic Diocese, and it was discovered both of them under the same roof were being raped by the same priest. Father Kokoczynski was moved to 7 places after the Toledo Catholic Diocese knew of the allegations of him raping raping his young victims.
So let's jump forward to 2003, I'm guessing at this point, and I'm not going to say her name, but obviously I have been in communication with her. The one who wrote the letter said she was abused by multiple priests and by Father Robinson, but she took that before the diocese review board, I guess, that information, and then talk about that, what you know about that situation.
So these cases have always belonged in front of police, prosecutors, and the courts. But in 2002, nationwide, after the Boston Globe story broke nationwide, really illuminating clergy sexual abuse across the country, victims came forward in mass, like unequaled. You know, in history, they'd never seen this kind of victims coming forward, the sheer number. And what happened was the U.S. bishops all gathered in Dallas, and they were there almost a week, and some victims were brought forward to testify before the U.S. bishops, and as a result of that, the U.S. Bishops' Conference, they established what was known as the Dallas Charter for the Protection of Youth. And it's where they promised from that point forward they were going to purge this evil from within the church. They pledged openness, honesty, and transparency. All the bishops, not some of the bishops, all of the bishops, including at that time Bishop James Hoffman, who was the bishop here in Toledo. So they all pledged openness, honesty, and transparency, and they convened these panels and a national review board and local review boards. But there were problems from the onset. None of those individuals were officers of the court. and they were not vetted nor trained, and there was no representation from the victims network, and certainly none from SNAP on those review boards, which tells you right away they're problematic. And so this victim, the catalyst for reopening this case, came forward to the review board, but she wasn't being received well. And I obtained a copy of the letter that she had presented before the review board, and I also obtained copies of the letters from the Toledo Catholic Diocese lawyers, Shoemaker, Loop, and Kendrick. And what they did during that time was they sent cease and desist letters to their own review board. And it was really an act of desperation. Their underbelly was showing. They said in the letter that this case had been thoroughly vetted and the allegations reviewed a year prior. Well, that was impossible because she had just gone before the review board the day before. So how did you review this the year before? You didn't even have a review board the year before. And it said that the prosecutor's office had already thoroughly vetted these allegations a year prior to that. But she had just come before the review board. So the math wasn't mathing. And they attached all these legal opinions to bolster their position, and they affirmatively told the review board there's no need to go to the police and prosecutors, which the very fact that they did that was really the actions of desperate men trying to put the fire out very quickly, because number one, the national spotlight that had gone on, right, from Boston and all across the country. I mean, scarcely a week would go by that these stories weren't being told in the news, right? Number two, the bishop had signed that proclamation with the local prosecutor here promising transparency, openness, and honesty. And here you're telling your own review board, don't go to the police and prosecutor? It's not necessary? Who does that? That makes no sense. And so we knew where there was smoke, there was fire. And obviously, he had always been rumored as the priest that got away with it.
So had she talked to anybody in the church? So when they say this has been reviewed like a year beforehand or investigated, had she gone to anybody in the church a year ago, or this review board? Was this the first time she'd even come out and told anybody?
It's the first time she'd appeared before the review board. So to say that these allegations had been thoroughly vetted couldn't have been. The dates didn't line up. The math made no sense. Like everything that she was bringing forth, there was no way, if you see the date on the letter, there was no way that letter and those allegations had been thoroughly vetted a year prior. There's no way that happened. Or arguably, wouldn't the case have been opened a year before?
Yeah, fascinating.
So,
and I have seen that letter, and I've read it, and I've had a communication with her, and she kind of talked about what had happened to her. But why did you believe her? Because there's many people who said, that sounds a little crazy. Why did you believe her?
The actions of the Toledo Catholic Diocese lawyers, they were desperate and heavy-handed. Not only did they send out that first letter, they sent out a second letter. And the second letter to the review board said, effectively, to the degree that you continue your involvement, we will also continue our involvement. And to me, that was a veiled threat. And I knew it. And no matter what one finds of the contents of the letter or the allegations, no matter if you find them fantastical or not, there is no statute of limitations on murder. And with so much illumination, not only nationally, but locally, I mean, we were exposing the diocese one case after another publicly during that time. So if ever there was a time that, and they had all those brand new policies and procedures and counsel, and they were doing it different this time, and yet they really weren't. It was business as usual. And it made no sense at all. Why wouldn't the bishop himself have laced up his gym shoes and sprinted over to the prosecutor's office with this information? Why would you discourage people from reporting? Can you imagine saying to people, don't call 911? Don't call 911. Don't report things to the police. It seemed counterintuitive to the very reason that they were supposed to be convening as a panel. And when the story did break, the Toledo Catholic Diocese PR person went out of her way to discredit the victim and malign her publicly. The national media that would call me and say, look, I heard she lived her life in a psych ward. And I'm like, that's not true. That is absolutely not true. Why? Why the need to besmirch her good name? Why the need to malign her? Let the facts stand as they are. What can be proven, what can't be proven. Why malign her? And then they started, the Toledo Catholic Diocese officials started maligning the own members of the review board. Why would you do that? It really was, their underbelly was showing.
There was one member of the review board who wanted to take it to the prosecutor, is that correct?
Absolutely.
And I know his name, I don't know if he wants his name mentioned, because I did talk to him also.
Probably not.
But
I know him well.
So talk about that, what you know about that situation.
Of course. I mean, you know, that review board member felt he had an ethical professional obligation to ensure that this was going before the police and the prosecutors, that they fully had the same information, because there is no statute of limitations on allegations of murder. And so it made no sense, the degree and the pressure, full court press that was coming upon this review board. Not to mention, that review board was supposed to operate independent, completely independent of the bishop. There wasn't supposed to be meddling. So how did Toledo Catholic Diocesan lawyers know what was going on in that review board, which was supposed to be closed off in private? How'd they know that? And how could they send out cease and desist letters so quickly after the victim was there? Not to mention, why would they send them out?
So then after this happened, how does it get to the point like, okay, they reject these claims and you work with her to get these claims sent to the Attorney General's office?
Well, across Ohio, different prosecutors' offices, they were convening grand juries. They were charging the Toledo Catholic Diocese, no, strike that. Across Ohio, different prosecutors were publicly calling on Catholic officials to be fully accountable, except here. There was nothing that was happening here. We had a proclamation from 2 years prior, but nobody had been charged, and there was no grand juries being convened, and there just wasn't the same public pressure on Catholic officials here locally that we were seeing not only in other states, but across the state of Ohio. And this was too big to chance. And the prosecutors, we are a Democratic town, and the AG's office at that time was Republican. And so we just tried to create some political pressure.
So then you worked with this victim, and she said, yeah, go ahead, send it. And you yourself actually sent it to the Attorney General's office.
Went there multiple times.
You went to, okay, tell me about that.
Multiple times. They had a satellite office in Bowling Green. So right over to Wood County, multiple times, and met with them and delivered documents.
What do you think was the final thing that actually got through to them? Because obviously they reached out to like Steve Forrester and Tom Ross and said, you guys should look into this. What do you think finally got through to them?
To the Attorney General's office? Well, I would like to think that there's no statute of limitations on murder, that touted as Toledo's most notorious murder investigation was closed up, unsolved in 3 weeks flat, and just the details that the prime suspect was plucked out of an interrogation room. Who does that? Who has that kind of pull? And I think that her life mattered. Her life counted. Her life was no less important. And he'd been walking around at that point for 24 years free.
What do you remember about the era of the trial? Obviously, there was, okay, I know that you guys had made a motion to somebody to say he should not be able to wear his priest stuff in court, correct?
We didn't make a motion. We took it to the court of public opinion. That's where we took it. We're just a group of volunteers. So we took it to the court of public opinion, and we said that would create an undue bias and influence the jury. And we didn't want to see the same deference that was clearly so blatantly given to him in the 80s, now given to him at her one shot for justice.
So what was your thought about the trial? I mean, I'm sure you were probably there every day.
I was there every day.
What were your impressions? What do you remember about that?
What I remember, both as the case broke open after the arrest of Father Robinson and even through the trial, was there was definitely a shift. There was a shift in the air. I think this was originally a reluctant investigation. I think when the Attorney General's office came calling locally, it was reluctant. And probably wasn't going to get as far as it got until they started really looking at the evidence that had been clearly there the whole time.
Yeah, and the exhumation of her body.
Absolutely.
A couple months after that seemed to be the turning point, because they were able to get the mandible out and the letter opener.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think the more they looked into, the more it couldn't be ignored, and her life mattered.
So how did you feel being in the courtroom and seeing Father Robinson? And people told me, jurors I've talked to, said they were put off by his demeanor. Some people said they wondered if he was drugged because he was so calm, and whether he was praying or whatever he was doing. But people were kind of put off by his apparent aloofness. What did you witness in the courtroom?
I was most taken back by how thorough the investigation really was, and how to the depths that they took that investigation. Especially when you look at how it started. I mean, when he was initially arrested, when Father Robinson was initially arrested, even Channel 11 held the story that first night. Did you know that? They did. You know who your lawyers were back then? Shoemaker, Loop, and Kendrick. So, in fact, one of your reporters, I can't remember her name, but she was lovely. She drove a VW Bug. Would you remember who I'm talking about? She was tall, blonde hair, drove a VW Bug. She was really wonderful. I just can't remember her name, and I'm sorry for that.
I think I know what you're talking about.
Yeah, well, so I can still remember her yelling at me on the phone and telling me, our lawyers are saying, and I'm like, I won't say I told you so tomorrow, but I'm telling you, I have been contacted by national news across this country. You're missing the story on this one, and you're giving too much deference to your lawyers. Who are your lawyers? And then that's how I found out who your lawyers were.
Yeah, that's interesting.
It's not a shining moment. Because
I wasn't there.
No, I understand, but Channel 11, you all are news leaders, right? You breaking stories, and this was the first priest ever charged and then ultimately convicted of murdering a nun, and which, even to the degree that they were still putting the full court press on to downplay this, and even if you look back at your own background file footage, look at one of the first press conferences that then Chief Navarre and Tom Ross, they are on camera telling, live, saying, this doesn't mean you shouldn't, that you should give up on the Catholic Church, and all the Catholic Church is bad. And I'm like, whoa, how is this even appropriate? Name another situation where you would have a police chief and a lead detective step outside their official role and say, it's important to know they're not all bad, or, I don't want to, I'm paraphrasing, but I found myself yelling at the television. And I'm not somebody that does that during sports events, but I was like, you gotta be kidding me. You're still trying to throw him a bone. No. And this is after the 2 no-knock search warrants. to me, that was when things really started to turn, those 2 no-knock search warrants.
Yeah, let's talk about that, because obviously I'm seeing the affidavit for the warrant, and so
Right.
then Forrester and Ross end up going up to the church. What do you know about that situation?
They asked for, so the investigators in the murder case asked for his personnel file, everything that you have on Father Robinson, and they were given 4 pages. There's more than that in my kindergarten file somewhere, right? Probably says excessive talker, I don't know. But seriously, they asked for everything that they had. They got 4 pages amid a murder investigation. And so they executed a no-knock search warrant. And then they had to execute a second one. Clearly, the deference that they were accustomed to shifted.
And I think they found more than 150 pages of documents at least.
I'm sure he'd been a lifelong priest. Of course they did. And then they found other files that have yet to be made public that should. And I was at that court proceeding too when the judge was ruling on whether or not to keep the file sealed. And I was very taken back because at that time, Thomas Aquinas Matuzak wrote on behalf of the prosecutor's office that, I'm paraphrasing, but to spare the diocese embarrassment, they wanted to keep that sealed. Hadn't that ship sailed? I mean, across Ohio and across the country, cases are springing up, about cover-up of clergy sexual abuse again and again and again. And the Toledo Catholic Diocese had been exposed over and over and over again for the exact same behavior, despite the fact that Toledo Catholic officials maintained that there was no pedophilia problem here. And they started mincing words during that time, pedophilia versus ephebophilia versus child predator. Child predator is a child predator. But my point is that they went out of their way to piecemeal and parcel and kept getting exposed in the media, exposed by your station, exposed in the printed press, on the radio. They were being exposed quite a bit. And yet now we're worried about embarrassing them? How does that work? I mean, that ship sailed.
Yeah. Let me ask you this before we get onto the sign, which I'm really interested in, but what were your emotions in the courtroom when you see this very valued local Catholic leader sitting there and on trial for murder? I mean, what were your emotions?
It was overwhelming. It was overwhelming from the point of his arrest. Parishioners put up their houses as collateral to get him bonded out, as though her life didn't matter. The evidence and the expert after expert after expert that testified, and the thorough investigation that the prosecutor's office did in leaving no stone unturned.
I think it's also interesting, so Judge Mandros had talked about the big challenge was getting a jury.
Right.
Because, so we had talked about the 1980 atmosphere in town. This was the era of reckoning with the Catholic Church.
Right.
Would he have been convicted in 1990?
I don't know, but I think had they done the kind of investigation, had they been allowed to do the kind of investigation that ultimately did obtain a conviction, probably. I mean, the evidence was there. They had him. They had the murder weapon. There were so many components, but it just all ended when Monsignor Schmidt, accompanied by Ray Vetter, plucked him out of the interrogation room. You can't name another instance where something like that would happen.
So let's talk about that. So there is this sign near Fifth Third, obviously. So let's talk about that. Start with who Monsignor Schmidt was and his role in this whole thing, and why you're so passionate about getting rid of the sign.
I think who we honor matters. Absolutely, who we honor matters. And Monsignor Jerome Schmidt was considered, as I said, a wheeler and dealer for the Toledo Catholic Diocese. I mean, he was their political front person, and I guess has done a lot of great things and made significant contributions to Mud Hens baseball. And that's all well and good. But the reality is, he helped obstruct and hinder justice for Sister Margaret Ann Pahl and her family and this community and the Sisters of Mercy, and that counts too. And who we honor is important. And you can't tell me that there is no one else out there affiliated with baseball who is less deserved than a man that really was the impetus for keeping justice delayed and this murder unsolved for over 2 decades.
So go back and talk about that, and I know you've mentioned this, but we're just going to talk about this again, how he obstructed in those early days of the investigation.
So detectives Art Marks and Lieutenant Keena were the detectives on the case. And they were actively interrogating him. They had the murder weapon. Their testimony was unrefuted at the trial. And considering how many years had elapsed, watching them testify and listening to their testimony, you can tell this was problematic for them over their years. They were very exacting in their words and what transpired. They literally were interrogating him when they testified that there was a knock at the door, and they were removed from their own interrogation of their prime suspect, Father Robinson, and made to stand outside of the interrogation room. And Ray Vetter, a high-ranking police official, and Monsignor Jerome Schmidt entered the interrogation room, which just seems unheard of. And after some time had elapsed, the door opens, Father Robinson is free to go, and the entire murder investigation is over in 3 weeks flat. That was hearing them testify and really understanding the depths and the length that had gone into ensuring that this case never got to a jury was really eye-opening, because if you'll cover for murder, what won't you cover for? So, I spent all these years advocating for openness, honesty, and transparency as it related to clergy sexual abuse. We were outmatched, because if you'll cover for murder, what real hope did we ever have to get garden variety child molesters out of there?
So that sign is essentially, in your mind, a slap in the face to Sister Margaret Pahl.
That sign, it's such a blemish. The Mud Hens are such a shining, all good things of Toledo thing that we have in the city, right? Like when your friends come from out of town, you take them to a Mud Hens game, kids go to a Mud Hens game, and families go to a Mud Hens game, and we have a public city sign with his name on it, Monsignor Jerome Schmidt, a public city sign. And I have asked every mayor since his conviction to take that sign down, based on the unrefuted testimony of detectives Art Marks and Lieutenant Keena. I've asked every one of them. And the answers I've gotten have ranged from absurd to ridiculous to being put off to being told, we're not really sure how you take a sign down. Even when I tell them insult to injury, it was dedicated on the anniversary of her murder. Just the appearance of impropriety should be enough to take that sign down. And I'm not talking about cancel culture. I'm talking about there's no place to honor someone who has obstructed a murder, no matter how much good they may have done in their life. It doesn't outweigh delaying justice for 24 years and putting the community at risk.
So fast forward up to 2014, Father Robinson dies in prison, I believe it was 2014. and he's given a full funeral mass. He's never defrocked, as far as I know.
Nope, he's never been defrocked.
So what are your thoughts about that he was given full honors, essentially, and it was never really acknowledged what he did?
I think it speaks largely to how little change we've really seen within the Toledo Catholic Diocese. They still have on private property honorariums for Monsignor Jerome Schmidt. On Holland Sylvania Road, you drive right down the road, Monsignor Jerome Schmidt Athletic Complex. The girls' locker room, outside the girls' locker room at Central Catholic High School, there's a placard in his picture honoring Monsignor Jerome Schmidt. It's inexcusable. We've asked the bishop to remove that multiple times. You know, only this past year did the bishop finally, and we've only been asking for 22 years, to have the Monsignor Doyle sign taken down outside the Toledo Catholic Diocese. And they did it quietly and secretively, instead of publicly saying, we were wrong and this should have come down.
If you could talk to the church leaders right now through this interview, and we're hoping to sit down and talk to them, what would you ask them? Not only a question you might wonder, but also ask them to do going forward. What would be your statement to them?
My statement to Bishop Daniel Thomas:
Church leaders.
It is never too late to do the right thing. Never too late. Instead of, it's time that Bishop Thomas come up and his cabinet come up with some fresh answers. If you look at even most recently, the priest that was convicted and is now serving multiple life sentences for human trafficking, Father Zacharias, the diocese tried to distance themselves, and they tried to posture themselves that was a bad apple, not a bad pie. And I would argue, going all the way back to Barbara Blaine and her abuse, to all the cases exposed since then, including the murder of Sister Margaret Ann Pahl and the conviction of Father Robinson, and now even on to Father Zacharias, that we've got a bad pie situation. And, you know, it's not too late to do the right thing, but it starts with an open dialogue, not prompted by PR people or lawyers. I'd ask them, what would Jesus do? How hard is it just to give a full, unabridged accounting and stop making excuses for what you knew and when you knew it? I've spent over 24 years exposing publicly, and another 7 privately, exposing this ongoing cover-up. When does it end? I mean, when does it end? You can't. Nothing good comes from secrecy and silence. Victims can't heal. Even the diocese's own website, they piecemeal and parcel out information instead of a full, unabridged accounting of it all. You know, you could end the need for victims groups if you partnered with victims and did the right thing. And it costs nothing. It costs nothing to tell the truth. There's nothing good that comes from this, as evidenced by the delay in justice. And I would ask, on behalf of the Pahl family and the Sisters of Mercy and all women out there and the community at large, take down those honorariums that honor Monsignor Jerome Schmidt. Not because he didn't contribute in those ways, but because of the pain and the suffering that he caused and the obstructing of justice that occurred when he accompanied Deputy Chief Ray Vetter and ended what was Toledo's most notorious murder investigation of that time.